Were there giants of the ancient past recorded in the book of Genesis? Are there going to be giants returning in some apocalyptic future recorded in the book of Revelation? And if you are at all willing to entertain that possibility, then let's get into it.
When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of the name. There is no passage in the Hebrew Bible that draws as much speculation as this one. These 4 brief verses have captivated many, and a plethora of interpretations have been proposed in order to explain what the authors are referring to. Among scholars, the 3 most popular interpretations are as follows. The first is the sons of God refer to descendants of Seth, and daughters of men refer to women born of the line of Cain. So some of the men from the righteous line of Seth took wives from the line of Cain, which led the godly Sethites into sin and rebellion.
If you're just listening to this on the podcast, by the way, we are in Genesis chapter 6, verse 1 through 4.
The second view is the sons of God refer to earthly kings or tribal leaders who used their power and authority to begin practicing polygamy, or the right of first night, by taking as many as they chose. The last view, which is the majority view among scholars today, is the sons of God refer to divine angelic beings who took human form and had unholy giant offspring known as Nephilim.
Okay, so this is Inspiring Philosophy, and he does a really good job of covering this topic. I will leave the link to this video, as well as the Haunted Cosmos video, which is very, very much worth watching. Very much worth watching. I will leave there's going to be all kinds of links in the description of this video. Those are going to be resources for you as you dive deep into this topic, which we tend to do. We want to give topics like this the time and the attention that they deserve. So we are going to unpack this. There's a whole lot of light and color on this rainbow, but there's a lot of gold at the very end. So stick with this one, okay? These are the 3 main views of the interpretation of Genesis 6 verses 1 through 4, where it talks about it's this strange passage that a lot of people stumble over, talking about Nephilim. They're men of renown. There's just enough strangeness there that you kind of want to follow the strangeness for a second. And so that's what we're doing. So as you look at these 3 views, the sort of Seth Cain view, the polygamous ruler view, and the giant angelic offspring view, the Nephilim view, where are you right now? And then wherever you are, I'm going to ask you to kind of suspend that belief and sort through this with me. Inspiring Philosophy, they do a lot of debates and stuff like that. I'm not necessarily interested in debating this topic. I'm interested in discussing this topic. And so, and the idea is that in a debate, you're really trying to just sort of pin things down. And in a discussion, I'm willing to entertain more things rather than trying to have them pinned down. So hopefully we understand that. I think ultimately it's more beneficial to have the discussion. I do think that there's a place for debate, but again, not necessarily what we're trying to do here, although I'm 100% willing to hear arguments and stuff like that. So where you think about it, what have you heard about this passage? And let's go from there.
The first view was historically more popular among early theologians like St. Augustine, Martin Luther, or John Calvin. However, many scholars from the other 2 views have argued that it doesn't account for the details of the passage. First, Meredith Klein points out the Hebrew term for man would have to change meaning from verse 1 to verse 2, without explanation or indication. In verse 1, man most likely refers to all of mankind, whereas in verse 2, it would have to refer to just the descendants of Cain. This shift in meaning is not indicated by the author, so it is unlikely. Next, the text does not distinguish between Seth's line as sons of God. Cain's descendants were still descendants from Adam, and therefore could have been seen as sons of God. Michael Heiser points out there is no indication marriages between Seth's line and Cain's line were prohibited. We are speaking of a time prior to the Mosaic Covenant and distinguishing between Jews and Gentiles.
If you don't know Michael Heiser, I will leave a link to this book as well, The Unseen Realm. He's done a lot. I've featured him here on this podcast a few times, but definitely worth looking into on this subject.
These and many other issues that scholars have pointed out have led to the Sethite interpretation falling out of favor. Michael Heiser proposes the divine interpretation of the text, that the passage is referring to the idea that angelic beings, known as sons of God, took human form and mated with women to produce unholy giants, known as Nephilim. This is the majority view among scholars today, and although I have the utmost respect for Heiser and scholars who take this view, I have slowly grown to reject it. The interpretation sounds interesting, but the more I study the passage and the context, the less I see it as the intended meaning of what the text is trying to tell us. The more I look at Genesis, the more I have become convinced this passage is referring to polygamous rulers who abused their power and brought condemnation upon humanity. So I'll offer the arguments for this view, and then address the main arguments for the angelic interpretation. My argument will be based on 4 points: immediate context, surrounding context, the larger context of the entirety of Genesis, and cultural parallels.
So there's his argument there. We're not going to cover every single thing in this video. We're using this as a jumping off point, as a place to build a foundation for a much bigger conversation that has to do with all of Scripture, not just this kind of like admittedly strange passage in Genesis 6, but what is ultimately happening all throughout Scripture and all throughout human history. Like, what is God up to? And ultimately, what has Christ done for us? Like, what is he fighting? What is he defeating on our behalf? And I think that is where things really come home for me, that this whole conversation is not just about whether or not giants existed in history, which maybe they did, but ultimately, like, what is God doing throughout human history so that I can locate myself in that story or on that map and then know how to live. And part of knowing how to live is knowing very clearly what Christ has done for me. And so, again, that's where the thing that this conversation takes on a much more important role for me in my own life. And when we get to the Haunted Cosmos episode, I think those guys do a really good job of kind of unpacking that part of the story for us. So, looking forward to that. Let's keep going with Michael Jones.
First, if nothing from the Hebrew Bible survived to the present, except these 4 verses, it could hardly be argued this passage refers to any sort of union between women and divine beings. Go with me for a minute and just look at what the text says by itself, without thinking of what later authors might indicate. The text begins by telling us mankind began to multiply throughout the land. Then it introduces another group, called sons of God, who wed daughters of men. Then in verse 3, God says, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh." Oddly enough, God's own statement tells us who has caused his anger. It was men, not men and divine beings. Verse 3 indicates the 2 groups of verse 2 were 2 classes of humans.
And this is where I'm going to disagree with Michael on this. It is convenient, if you're wanting to propose the polygamous view, to separate this passage into its verses. But you have to remember that the verses in Scripture are not divinely inspired. The author who wrote this wrote complete sentences. And so when we look at the passage itself, we can't overlook the fact that verse 1 and verse 2 are a complete sentence. When men began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, comma, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and they took wives for themselves, whoever they chose. Then verse 3 starts a new sentence. So for me, the passage does focus on humanity. It is the story of humanity, sin that corrupted, and what happened after that. But I don't know why I have to separate humanity from what's happening with this sort of rebellious divine council that also exists within God's total world, even though there's a natural part of the world and there's a spiritual part of the world. I mean, humanity is the dust of the earth and the breath of God. Those 2 realities form one reality that God made. And so for me, when I read this passage, I do see that it's about humanity and there is a focus there of humanity. But for me, it's the story of humanity that is intertwined with what's going on in this sort of cosmic or heavenly realm, that the sins of humanity are at the very least influenced by this rebellion that is also happening. I mean, we see that in Genesis chapter 3, which we'll get here in a second. So they're more intertwined in my view, at least.
Verse 1 sets the context. It is about humankind producing offspring, and verse 3 indicates the problem arises from two classes of humans. Proponents of the divine interpretation have often tried to counter this by citing parallels to Genesis 3, which does indicate the sin of a divine being, the Nahash. But if you notice, the parallels between Genesis 3 and Genesis 6 are with the sins of Eve, not the sins of the Nahash. Eve saw that the fruit was good, parallels the sons of God, who saw that the women were beautiful. Eve took of the fruit, parallels the phrase that the sons of God took as their wives any they chose. So parallels to Genesis 3 indicate the sins of the sons of God were that of human sins.
I think that Genesis 3 really is a great parallel to Genesis 6, but I think it's a great parallel for a very different reason. When we look at Genesis 3:15, now this is after the fall, this is after sin. God is talking to Adam, he's talking to Eve, but he's also addressing, specifically he addresses the serpent, the Nahash, the enemy. And this is what he says: "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel." Now again, this is to the serpent. And what God is saying is really interesting within the context of a patriarchal society, because certainly the ancient culture would have thought the seed of the man more important than the seed of the woman. So this seed of the woman jumps off the page when you think about it in that original context. Why is God talking about someone who will be born of a woman, not born of a man, who will come? He shall be bruised, but he will also crush the head of the serpent. Now remember, God is saying this to the serpent. The serpent doesn't want his head crushed. So he goes, okay, I see your plan. Why don't I create my own version of that plan? And so what you have in Genesis 6, 1-4 is the unholy Trinity, is the enemy of God trying to thwart the plan of God by perverting that plan to his own will and his own desires. Because again, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, it was the daughters who were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. They took wives for that, whoever they chose. Verse 4, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came to the daughters of men and bore children to them. They are trying to pervert the plan of God in their own way. They bore children to them. These were mighty men, men of old, men of renown. Francis Schaeffer talks about this when he's talking about Roman pantheon of gods, that they were amplified humanity, but not divinity. We kind of see that here. These men, these mighty men, are created out of this offspring. Not true Christ-like, not the true Christ, not the true incarnation of God in human flesh, but a perversion of that. Amplified humanity, but not divinity. Jesus is divine, and when we pick up this theme in the book of Revelation, which we will, you will see that more clearly. The Antichrist tries to be like Christ, but in every way perverts the action of the true Christ. So to me, and Michael's going to go in here and just go in specifically to the direct passage, and this is part of his emphasis. He would say that if we just look at these passages and look at what they're saying, which is a good thing, he comes up with this interpretation that it's about polygamy and not about a rebellion that happens in the counsel of God, the heavenly counsel of God, that then has something to do with, and it's not the result. Human sin belongs to humanity. We need to own that. But that's the sin of humanity and the rebellion of this divine counsel interwoven in the story of history that we're seeing. So to me, I do the complete opposite than Michael Jones. He's hyper-focused on these passages, which is not a bad thing to do. But for me, I look at these passages, and what helps me interpret them is the full story of the Bible.
So parallels to Genesis 3 indicate the sins of the sons of God were that of human sins. Second, if the sons of God were divine beings who sinned, like in Genesis 3, we should see a separate judgment passed on them, like in Genesis 3. Instead, God's anger is only directed at humans. This seems to indicate only humans are at play, and not humans and divine beings.
I don't see why that would have to be the case, because to me, it seems like the two stories are wrapped into one. A lot of people would say that these Nephilim were judged in the flood. We can also see that if we're looking to the book of Revelation, they are also judged there.
The term Son of God in Hebrew is a phrase that refers to a divine being. But given the context here, as we are arguing, that might not be the case in Genesis 6. And there are times humans are referred to as children of God, although the Hebrew phrase is never used.
Thematically, yeah, you could link those two, but not from the text. If you're looking at the text uses this word, Son of God. It's this right here, Bene Ha Elohim. It's different than talking about humanity as God's children. It's very distinct what Scripture is, what the text is pointing to.
Now, Michael Heiser has argued extensively from the Hebrew grammar that the phrase, and also afterward, refers to after the flood, and that the text does refer to the Nephilim being the children of the sons of God, whether they were divine beings or ancient rulers. Now, Heiser does make a very convincing argument that the Nephilim are the offspring of the sons of God. But if this is the case, the immediate context also implies we are talking about a class of humans, not quasi-divine giants. It is very rare when a word is directly defined for us, but in the case of Genesis 6, the Nephilim are defined in verse 4 as simply men, namely mighty men who were of old, the men of the name.
So I think this is one of the stronger parts of his argument, because he's right. The passage is defining who the Nephilim are for us. Now he says they are just men, but the passage actually, and maybe I'm getting a little nuanced here, but the passage just does say mighty men who are of old, men of renown, men of the name. And so they are making a distinction. The text does make a distinction between men and mighty men. And we'll pick this up with Nimrod and Babel, which I think is important. So I would not say they're not men. I just think that they are a certain kind of unholy offspring that the text is trying to draw our attention to. And certainly it leaves the door open for the idea that they might be bigger than a normal human. And we will get to that when we look at Goliath and what that might be foreshadowing even beyond that. And so certainly leaves the door open for giant men, but also just sort of like these unholy men. Like, this is not supposed to be this way. That is why the text is drawing our attention to them as being distinct from just normal men that just came about through normal baby making. There's something to this that the text is drawing our attention to.
Drawing on the work of Paul Copan and Douglas Jacoby, who also agree with Heiser the Nephilim are semi-divine, we can see in the simplest sense of the context, the word doesn't refer to anything other than prideful humans attempting to make a name for themselves. To quote, "The fallen ones, warriors of renown, literally men of the name, sought their own honor and glory, like Cain, who named a city after himself, and the architects of Babel, who sought to make a name for themselves. In contrast, followers of Yahweh seek his honor and glory." In other words, the Nephilim are directly defined in verse 4 as prideful humans who sought their own honor and glory. The attention is on their prideful nature as humans, not as semi-divine creatures.
Again, I think that this is a good passage. I think it also links the activities of Genesis 6 with the later story of Babel. I don't disagree that it's about prideful humanity. It's about humanity trying to reach God status, let's say. But again, I think that story of humanity has just been intermixed with the rebellion that has taken place in the divine council. So these fallen ones, they're warriors of renown. They try to make it sound like these are just people. Well, if they're just people, then why are they called warriors of renown? Why are they referred to this way? I do think that they want to seek their own glory and overthrow the glory of God, which again, just in my mind, sort of reinforces the way I think about this, coming all the way from Genesis 3:15 and the serpent, the enemy, trying to overthrow the plan of God.
As John Walton says, cohabitation between angels and humans has no immediate obvious connection with the purposes of Genesis. An angelic intrusion is considered out of place in the sequence of episodes recounting the advance of human sin.
I think that this is because you have overlooked Genesis 3:15. Well, you overlooked Genesis 3. I mean, the whole fall of humanity has to do with humanity cohabitating with the serpent, the enemy, the fallen one. Like I don't get it. I don't get why we're overlooking that part. I do get it. I think the reason some people want to overlook that is that they're taking a more materialistic or maybe a more naturalistic view to their interpretation of Scripture. They don't want to be supernaturalists. They think that being a supernaturalist makes them weird or strange, and so they're trying to find a more naturalistic explanation for why these things took place. I think that's a mistake, because then I think you don't really understand your own time and your own place in the events of that time.
Next, the full context of Genesis better fits with the idea we are talking about mere humans becoming polygamous and caring only about making a name for themselves. As we noted in our video on Genesis 4, the authors or compilers of Genesis constantly condemn polygamy by narrating the disastrous effects it causes. The sins of Lamech represent a fallen state of humanity. By Abraham having a son with Hagar, it causes strife between Ishmael and Isaac, and jealousy in Sarah, and ultimately, Hagar is banished because of it. By Jacob having 2 wives, it creates competition between them, and then favoritism, jealousy, hatred, and numerous other problems within his family.
Correct. And yet, God doesn't flood the entire earth. So I think the polygamy explanation just doesn't fit the larger story of the Bible, particularly when it comes to these polygamous relationships happening within the patriarchal family. This is God establishing his people, his family. There's polygamy going on here. Why wouldn't he? If polygamy in Genesis 6 led to the flood, why, when God is establishing his own family and polygamy occurs, it's kind of like, yeah, it definitely causes problems. Of course it causes problems, but not a catastrophic flood type of problem. Just fighting, the types of problems you would expect if you had more than one wife.
Second, Meredith Klein notes Nimrod also falls into the same category as the Nephilim, as a mighty man. The same word used to describe Nimrod is also used to describe the Nephilim. Yet it is clear Nimrod was not semi-divine, but a descendant of Cush. This connection also makes it likely the Nephilim were viewed as human.
This is where things get even a little bit more interesting. If you're interested at this point, thank you for being here. Thank you. Because we do want to take the time to talk about these things. I'm going to get to this Gabor here in a second. But if you haven't subscribed, if you haven't hit the like button, that does help, because it's a small channel. I don't have like the reach, and I want to reach the people that want to have these meaningful conversations. So if you know somebody who would benefit from this conversation, definitely share that with friends, family, et cetera, et cetera. It really does help. So thank you for being, it's like a community. And I love that. That's one of the great things about doing this. So, okay. This word Gabor that is used for Nimrod. And again, it's like, oh, he's the descendant of Cush. He's not some semi-divine. Okay. I get it. I totally get that. Like, and again, I wonder what Michael Jones is thinking when he thinks of giants and when he thinks of Nephilim and all that stuff. The Nimrod being described as a mighty one, he is a Gabor. Okay, now the word Gabor can mean giant. It doesn't always mean giant, but it can mean giant. And we cannot overlook that here, which is unfortunately omitted from this video that we're taking a look at. So it can mean giant. The name Nimrod can even be translated, or it can be hinted at. The language is kind of difficult, but it can be rebellion, rebellious. He became a mighty one. Okay, again, those word Gabor can be used for giant, before the Lord. Now, this could mean in the face of or against the Lord. So this Nimrod, this Gabor, this mighty one on the earth who seems to be in rebellion and is maybe like in the face of God, what does he build? Well, he builds Babel, And so that, again, is going to be something that we pick up in the book of Revelation. This Babel, being this city built by Nimrod, is in a sense becomes a symbol for the rebellion that we've been talking about. So there's a heavenly rebellion, there is a earthly rebellion, they're sort of all mixed together, and this city becomes a symbol of that. Nimrod being sort of the, I don't know, maybe like the first tyrant. Now, he's a hunter, and of course, people that look into giants and stuff like that, they might make more of this than it really is, because giants are said to be cannibals and things like that. But if you think about what is he hunting? Is he just hunting game, or is he hunting people? Is that what it means to be a mighty hunter against the Lord? He's hunting down the people of God. We're getting into some interpretive stuff here, but in a way, you see Cain. I see these as linked to Cain. Cain builds the first city, right? They've been evicted from Eden. He goes out, he builds the first city. Cain is also the first murderer. So I look now at Nimrod, who's building all these cities. He's this big city builder, but he's also this mighty hunter. Is he just a tyrant, and therefore he can get away with being a serial killer? Because that's what tyrants do. And so you would have Cain as the first murderer. Nimrod is the first serial killer. He sets himself up as a tyrant. And so Babel becomes this symbol of rebellion. Of course it is. It is the city that is set up in defiance of God. It's where men try to make a name for themselves, which again ties into everything that we've just been talking about and will tie in to the book of Revelation. So this rebellious people, there's a rebellious people coming up. So we have this Nimrod figure who is a mighty one. He is a Gabor. Does that mean he's just a man? No, it means he is a mighty man. There's something distinct that the text is pointing out. And of course, where else is this word used? Again, it's not always used for giant, but it can mean giant. It is used to describe Goliath, the Bible's most famous giant. And not a lot of people are going to disagree with the fact that Goliath was a significant figure. There's going to be some debate about how tall Goliath actually was, and that's fine. And the Haunted Cosmos guys are going to point this out in their video. So credit to them. Saul is intimidated by Goliath. Saul is said to be like 6'6". So Saul, the king of Israel at the time, is pretty big. He's a pretty big guy. And yet he's intimidated by the size of Goliath. You also have Goliath's armor being described, and that's really important. This is 1 Samuel 17:4. Then a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. This is where people will get a little technical, and they'll be like, oh, he wasn't that big, because depending on how you calculate, whether it's the Hebrew calculation or the Egyptian calculation, maybe Goliath wasn't that big. And again, these are the people that, they don't want to look silly believing in giants and fairy tales and stuff like that. But again, you look at the you look at the context surrounding Goliath. He is a big guy, right? There's nothing else that explains what is going on in this scene. And the writers of this passage are obviously trying to indicate that this man is very intimidating. He is imposing his will on the nation of Israel, God's people. He had a bronze helmet in his head, and he was clothed with a scale armor, which weighed about 5,000 shekels of bronze. He also had bronze shin guards on his legs and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. His shield carrier also walked before him. So this scene tells us that Goliath is a giant man. I mean, he is very large. All his armor is very heavy. His spear is very thick. He is a giant of a man. And you know what else is so funny? He is clothed in scales. He's clothed in scales. What happened in remind me of Genesis 3:15 again? Who was it? Was it it was the serpent. It was the serpent that launched the attack against God's design and God's plan. Now, there's this Genesis 6 that has these Nephilim that show up. And now you have this serpent, this giant person covered in scale-like armor. He looks like a dragon. He looks like the serpent. He looks like the enemy of God. And the text is very particular about telling you that. But then what? Well, the man of God, David, the king of Israel, the man after God's own heart. So David put his hand into his bag and took from it the stone slung for it, struck the Philistine on that forehead, and the stone sank into his forehead so that he fell on his face to the ground. Thus David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in David's hand. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his own sword, drew it, and cut it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. So David cuts off the head of Goliath, the enemy of God, clothed in scales. David, the man of God, the man after God's own heart, the king of Israel, uses the weapon of the enemy to defeat the enemy ultimately. That is what Christ has done for us. And this is where I think the Haunted Cosmos guys really do bring it home.
Van Dorn in his book is really helpful here. Like I said before, his spear was likely 50 pounds or maybe more. His armor was upwards of 160 pounds. He was a descendant of the Rephaim, the undisputed giants. He inspired terror and fear in 6'6" King Saul, presumably because of his immense size and strength. Typologically, David was a king after God's own heart, a type of Christ before the real Christ came in his first advent. Christ doesn't kill the giant only a few inches taller than us, a few inches shorter than many NBA players. No, Christ kills the indescribably tall giant of our sin and death and the devil. His lesser types in the Old Testament certainly take after him and do the same. What makes the most sense of all the biblical data is to say that Goliath was almost 10 feet tall.
We see this theme. It traces all the way back, obviously, to Genesis 3:15.
Right.
That the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. He will be wounded himself. His heel will be crushed. Christ ultimately fulfills this. But here's my favorite part. So David crushes his head, this scaly, giant, dragony serpent. Dog of a man. And then he cuts his head off with his own sword.
Yeah.
Christ on the cross crushes the head of the serpent, defeats death with its own weapon, which is death itself. He tramples down death by death.
Yeah.
Christ is the ultimate head crusher. He's the ultimate David who slays the giant of sin and death and the serpent on our behalf. So this whole theme, again, draws together, or this picture of Goliath, it draws together all of these threads to associate demonic death cult worship with fallen angels and the seed of the serpent, and then also with Christ's victory crushing the head of the giant serpent dragon enemies.
Isn't that amazing?
It's so amazing.
That is so cool.
So amazing.
So this is where, again, it just comes home for us. It is important to know that we're talking typologically, and all credit to the Haunted Cosmos guys, because one of the things that they point out is that when we're talking typologically, it's important to make the distinction that we're not saying that these things are made up, that this thing that happened is like this other thing. That's what we're talking about. So David is like a Christ. Goliath is seemingly a giant, but what is that giant like? The giant is the thing that we have to overcome, and what we need to remember is that Christ has won that victory for us. That giant is our sin, our depravity. It's the total weight of human depravity. So as we go into the book of Revelation and we look at how this story sort of culminates, and I don't know that I'm going to say concludes, but this story culminates with this manifestation of beasts, this antichrist figure who shows up in defiance of Yahweh and in defiance of God's people. And so again, this is kind of, we're just tying the whole thing together. We pick it up in chapter 12, verse 3. Another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems. What is the dragon doing? The dragon is trying to destroy the child that is about to be born. And the tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour the child. This is Genesis 3:15. God promises that the seed of the woman is going to destroy this head of the serpent, going to crush the serpent's head. So the serpent tries to overcome the child who is about to be born, but can't. That is where we have our hope. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne, so the dragon cannot overcome the child. And then Michael shows up on the scene, and then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, he who accuses them before our God day and night. And they, that is the church, that is the people of God, overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives even when faced with death. And so you have this theme coming through all of Scripture. I mean, just real quick, you have Genesis 3, you have Genesis 6, you have Nimrod then contrasted with Abraham. Nimrod is the city builder. He's the man who stands in defiance of God. He's in rebellion to God. He's called a Gabor. He builds the city. Abraham, well, he builds the city of Babel where humanity is trying to make a name great for themselves. Abraham is pulled out of the wilderness, and God says, I will make your name great. So Abraham lives in the wilderness. He doesn't build a city. He follows the Lord where the Lord leads, and God makes his name great. Then you have David and Goliath. You have Israel. Well, before that, you have Israel and Canaan, where there are giants in the land. We didn't even get to that part. You have David. You have Goliath. You have the church and this rebellious nation that comes from Babel. You have the people of God who stand in freedom or they stand in his freedom and his victory over this antichrist figure who, again, we've already talked about, is trying to be like Christ in every way, but is perverting it. See, he even tries to cause the flood, right? The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman so that he might cause her to be swept away in a flood. So he creates a flood just like Yahweh did. He performs great signs. We're in Revelation 13:13. He performs great signs so that even makes fire come down of heaven. Okay, this is prophet-like. Okay, he gives breath to the image of the beast. So this is God, creating out of the dust and breathing into man. And yet what the Antichrist creates is a beast figure. Cain, when God confronts him, he says, sin is crouching at your door and wants to devour you like a beast. And so this beast, this And again, the beast in the book of Revelation are not the giants that we've been talking about. But again, if we're saying this thing is like that thing, what is the manifestation of our sin? What does the enemy do with that? Again, all of this is to really understand what Christ has done for us. The people who follow after the beast, after this Antichrist figure, they're marked on the right hand of the forehead. And the question then is, who marks you? The hand is the works that you do, the mind, the forehead, the thoughts that you have. And what are the things that mark you? Are you a person like Nimrod who lives in defiance before the face of the Lord, building a city for your own name? Is that what marks you? Or do you, like Abraham, live for Yahweh and follow in obedience to Yahweh? And is that what marks you? Now, here we go. We're going to bring this whole thing full circle. And then Michael Heiser has some great stuff on this that I want to share with you. But here it is. Here is wisdom. And again, this is the Antichrist figure who is perverting the image of the true Christ in order to deceive people, right? It's Genesis 3 all over again. Here's the wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for the number is that of a man, and his number is 666. You knew we had to go there, right? We just had to go there. We had to go into the 666. And I did bring this up in another episode, but most people will say, okay, I get it. It's the number of the man, and it's the perfect man. Most people can get there pretty easily. The 3 6s, 3 being perfection, 6 being the number of man. So you're there. You're there with me. Most people are. Irenaeus points out that the name Titan can, if you look at the letters and the numbers that correspond to the name Titan, or the word Titan being used as a name, that would be calculated up to 666. It's thin, I'll give you that, because it's actually an alternate spelling of Titan, but it's there. And the idea is that you have this, again, it's a unholy trinity, an unholy union between that which is happening in the spiritual realm, that which is happening in the material realm, and the perverse offspring of that sin and defiance and rebellion becomes this Titan imagery, a semi-divine human that would stand in the face of Christ, who is the fully divine human, who is the true conqueror of the Goliaths, of the beast, the true conqueror of the enemy who accuses the church. And again, and we go right into chapter 14 after this. And then I looked, and behold, the Lamb was standing on Mount Zion. So you have Babel, you have Zion, Zion is the city of God. This is restoring God's original creation from Eden. And what stands in contrast to Zion? Babel. And where was Babel? Nimrod is the connection there to Babel. He was standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 having his name and the name of his father written on their forehead. So it's not about making a name for yourself. It's about standing in union and harmony with him and being marked by his name. So that the church, the people of God who stand in Christ's victory, are the force against the anti-Eden of the beast and Babylon and the Antichrist. And we have to know that. We have to know that. Now, are we going into some apocalypse? Everybody has their own apocalypse. Everybody meets their end time at some point. And so I'm not here saying that we are there. I think that there are birth pains. There is a process. What I am saying is, as we move forward in time, as God unfolds his sovereign plan for humanity and history, it's very important that you know who you are, and it's very important to know who is winning your victory for you. In contrast to Goliath, we can look at the armor that God gives us, right? Finally, brethren, be strong in the Lord and the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God so that you'll be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, and against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly realm. That is what we have been talking about. And guess what? We're not ill-equipped for this battle. We have the armor of God. Keep the full armor of God so that you'll be able to resist in the evil day, having done everything to stand firm. And I think this is key. There's more to this. Obviously, there always is. I come to this and I'm like, there's always more to be done. So if you want to catch a live stream Wednesday afternoons, and I'll unpack this maybe a little bit more. Stand firm, therefore, having girded your loins with truth. That means the most vulnerable parts of you. You need to know what the truth is, because otherwise your vulnerabilities will be exposed. Put on the breastplate of righteousness, having shod your feet with the preparation of the gospel of peace. That means, we can't take this message keep this message to ourselves. In addition to all this, taking up the shield of faith, which you will be able to extinguish the flaming arrows of the evil one, and take the helmet of salvation. This is what I'm talking about. We need to know who we are, where we are on the map of history. And the helmet is, again, this is helping me. It's covering my mind from the deception of the enemy who would try to pull me away from the true Christ and have me believing in the Antichrist. I need to have the helmet of salvation. So where is my salvation? And I need to know that. I need to know in my mind who is winning my victories for me. Who is it who has conquered the beast? Cain could not slay the beast who was crouching at his door in Genesis. Christ has slain the beast because we can't. That's why I think this is important for the Christian person. Now, it's interesting because for the Christian person, you're there. You have put your faith in Jesus Christ. So the battle for you has been won. Why are the feet shod with the gospel of peace? Because there are people out there who have not won. And they need Christ. They need victory in Christ. And that's why the church stands as the kind of the next great opposition, maybe the next opposition to the schemes of the enemy. We can't just retreat into our own little walls, we can't retreat into our own little cities like Cain did because he was afraid to be out in the wilderness. We have to be more like Abraham, who is wandering in the wilderness, who is going where God has called him to be, even though he might feel vulnerable because he's nomadic and he lives in tents. We have to be these people spreading this message because there are people out there who are completely vulnerable to the schemes of the enemy. So why is Genesis chapter 6 important? Yeah, it's a strange passage, and we often stumble over it because it's weird. But sometimes that weirdness gets you clued into the fact that there's a bigger picture, there's a bigger story going on. And if we don't know what that story is, we won't know how to help people. We will be a liability and not an asset for the people who are lost in this world. So now I'm starting to get on a little bit of a sort of a podium here. So if you're here right now, thank you. Because this is so important. I really do feel that. I really do sense that. And so we need to share this bad boy. We need to share this message. You don't have to share this video. Just take this whole plan, memorize it, and share it with people. Tell this story of Christ winning the victory to the people who are looking at the things going on in this world right now, today, and freaking out. Because they don't have that helmet of salvation. They don't know where their salvation is coming from. Okay, so let's do that. Let's be a people who spread this message of hope in the time of chaos. Catch you in the next one.